Chapter 11 of Hard Times is called No Way Out, and it's about the way that Stephen Blackpool isn't allowed to divorce his wife so that he can marry Rachel. And Dickens here shows Stephen talking to Bounderby and really shows the contrast between the two men. Bounderby with all his bluster, who essentially is a hypocrite, and Stephen, who is genuine and he's good, but speaks in a far more simplistic way. And so what we get is about 10 or 11 lines down, we get Dickens in on page 69 saying, "Set anywhere side by side the work of God and the work of man, and the former, even though it be a troop of hands of very small account, will gain in dignity from the comparison." So Dickens making the point that whatever man does, it can never be, rivaling God's work. And that's nice to set alongside the description of Sissy with the sun shining on her. So Dickens is really focused on, the innocence and beauty of nature, compared to this real pride in the Victorian era with the industrial sort of revolution that they've had and the things that they can create. And Dickens making the point that actually the hands and this utilitarian society is only going to get you so far. And actually people are losing sight of what's natural and innocent and good. And we see that right at the bottom of page 69 when we're told more clattering upon the pavements, the looms and wheels and hands all out of gear for an hour. So the hands are put at the end of a list after looms and wheels, and they're described as being out of gear. So the people quite literally are just these objects, they are just hands, have become just like machinery. So Dickens is making the point that in this society people are losing their humanity, they're being stripped away to just be objects and nothing more. We get on page 70, about 3/4 of the way down, Bounderby speaking to Stephen, and he says to him, "We have never had any difficulty with you, and you've never been one of the unreasonable ones. You don't expect to be set up in a coach and six and to be fed on turtle soup and venison." That's a recurring image. Bounderby keeps saying that if you treat the working classes too well, they'll rise up and want turtle soup and venison. And Dickens repeats the image just to make it clear how ridiculous it is that Bounderby is speaking from the point of view of the rich who's completely out of touch and won't listen or won't trust the working classes, and that therefore allows people like Slackbridge, who are the real threat, to sort of rise up. Halfway down page 71, Stephen Blackpool says, "Sir, I hope I never had nought to say, not fit for a born lady to hear, since I was born myself." So again, we get Stephen's real decency coming out there, okay? The idea that Dickens writes in his dialect and it's quite hard to read, as with Sleary, it's quite hard to sort of make sense of what he's saying. But he's making the point that actually Stephen's, language, because it's harder to sort of say, is more simplistic and more good and more honest, for that. Compare it to Bounderby's bluster, always speaking, but it's just hot air. He's like a balloon filled with hot air. We're told on page 72, right at the top, that his wife is from bad to worse, from worse to worse. "She left me, she disgraced herself every way, is bitter and bad. She come back, she come back, she come back." So with that repetition, Dickens is showing how Stephen Blackpool can never be rid of this wife, who represents these, this sort of wasted youth. She's always back to him, he can never escape. So just like with Bryony, there's that sense, in atonement that Stephen can never quite escape this mistake that he's made. He can never quite be free. The chapter's called No Way Out, and the wife represents that missed opportunity. And then we see on page 73, about a quarter of the way down, Bounderby completely unsympathetic. "What do you mean," to Bounderby, "getting up to lean his back against the chimney piece? What are you talking about? You took her for better or for worse." So he's using the marriage vows against Stephen, making the point basically that Stephen's stuck with this wife because he's made this vow. That's set against the fact that later on Bounderby reveals that had Stephen been richer, he could have got out of the marriage. So again, Dickens is juxtaposing the sort of supposedly religious views alongside what actually is about money and hypocritical. We get that a few lines down, just before halfway down, page 73, Mrs. Sparsit chips in. "He wishes to be free, to marry the female of whom he speaks, I fear, sir," observed Mrs. Sparsit in an undertone, and much dejected by the immorality of the people. So Dickens again uses that omniscient narrator to really, hint at Mrs. Sparsit's total disgust at this situation. And Dickens is laying bare again the hypocrisy at the heart of the Victorian system, where Bounderby can marry Louisa and it's totally the wrong thing, but Stephen isn't allowed to divorce a wife who represents everything bad sort of in the world. Stephen speaks at more length, about 5 or 6 lines down on page 74. He says, "'Tis kept down that way. I'm a weaver, or in a factory when a child, but I've gotten even to see with and to earn, and ears to hear with. I read in the papers every sizes, every sessions, and you read too. I know it with dismay. How the supposed impossibility of ever getting unchained from one another at any price, on any terms, brings blood upon this land, and brings many common married folk to battle, murder, and sudden death." And that's Dickens really speaking through Stephen, saying, the problem, this chaining of people together through marriage isn't helping. It's causing actually, major problems when people are staying married when they shouldn't be. We see it in Louisa at the end of book 2, who falls down at her father's feet. And the chaining, the description of them chaining together, Dickens is making that link between the industrial and the factory society and this unfairness, making that clear link between utilitarianism and lost childhood and lost, sort of chances. And Stephen, right at the bottom of page 74, about 5 or 6 lines before the bottom, says, "'Tis a muddle, 'tis just a muddle altogether, and the sooner I'm dead, the better." And again, Stephen, with real simplicity, just hits at the heart of it, doesn't he? It's a muddle. Dickens is pointing out the illogical nature of this society. Again, in brackets, we get Mrs. Sparsit again dejected by the impiety of the people. So Dickens again using that free and direct discourse to show, Mrs. Sparsit's sort of total outrage. But by putting it in a stage direction, he's making it that bit more dramatic, he's making it that bit more imaginative, and making it basically everything that this society sort of is trying to suppress. So he's showing his own feelings while apparently showing Mrs. Sparsit's. And about 10 or 11 lines before the end on page 75, Bounderby says, "I can see as far into a grindstone as another man, farther than a good many perhaps, because I had my nose well kept to it when I was young. I see trace of turtle soup and venison and gold spoon in this, yes I do." So Bounderby saying, look, this can't end well, you're getting ideas above your station, and I should know, because I had a hard start, my nose was pressed close to the grindstone. Again, Bounderby being a hypocrite, but the grindstone, Mr. Grind, I think is a deliberate play on words there. That Gradgrind is, this grindstone really, who is grinding everybody down. And while Bounderby's stories of his youth are, a total lie really, and bluster and hot air, there's that sense that Mr. Gradgrind is doing very real damage to the people who he comes across with. Chapter 12 is called The Old Woman, and that's where we meet this old woman who ends up being Bounderby's mum, who ends up sort of pulling the rug under his feet. And the only thing I think really worth pointing out in this chapter is on page 79. Just before the halfway point, we're told, "Machinery slackened, throbbing feebly like a fainting pulse, stopped, the bell again, the glare of light and the heat dispelled, the factories looming heavy in the black wet night, their tall chimneys rising up into the air like competing towers of Babel." So Dickens describes the machinery slackening, throbbing feebly like a fainting pulse. So again, we've got the machinery alongside the sort of dying out of life, okay, alongside the stifling of childhood, basically, in children. Dickens is again doing that. It's reducing people from a pulse, from a living being, to simply a hand who's got a function. And he talks about competing towers of Babel. Now, contextually, in the Bible, the towers of Babel basically were built by this society who had pretensions of grandeur and trying to sort of rival God, rival God's power, and they were punished, and the towers were sort of struck down to show God's might. So again, Dickens is building up this society, saying, yes, it's powerful, but ultimately, it's not worthy of God, and ultimately people are going to be punished. So why we get the references to winter, the references to revolution. Dickens is saying essentially this society needs to change. And actually Stephen, with his simplicity, and Sissy with her childhood, are the ways to do it, rather than Bounderby and Gradgrind with their bluster and their focus on facts.